Under a howling Wyoming blizzard, a frail, 60-pound creature lay abandoned in the freezing mud, its lungs rattling with what should have been a final breath. One wealthy rancher saw a worthless liability meant for the coyotes. But the woman who knelt beside it saw a survivor. April in Sublette County, Wyoming, doesn't bring spring. It brings a bitter, freezing mud that clings to everything it touches. For 32-year-old Abigail Lawson, the mud was just another layer of exhaustion. Since her father passed away 2 years prior, leaving her with 80 acres of failing pasture and a mountain of debt, Abby had been working 70-hour weeks just to keep the bank from taking her family's legacy. To make ends meet, she took a seasonal night calving job at Iron Creek Cattle Company. Iron Creek was a massive, ruthless, 5,000-head commercial operation run by Clayton Montgomery. Clayton was a third-generation rancher who ran his empire like a factory. He didn't care about individual animals. He cared about weaning weights, market prices, and yield. If a cow couldn't produce, she was put on a truck to the slaughterhouse. If a calf was born weak, it was left to the elements. Nature's tax, Clayton called it. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when cow number 812, a massive Angus Simmental cross, went into agonizing labor. Abby was thigh-deep in the freezing slush of the maternity pen, fighting to pull the calf. When the calf finally slid into the straw, it was a monster, a 95-pound bull calf, strong and thrashing, but number 812 wasn't done. By 10 minutes later, she dropped a second amniotic sac. Twins. Except the second calf wasn't like the first. It was a severely underdeveloped, scrawny sack of bones, weighing barely 45 pounds. Its coat was slicked flat against ribs that protruded sharply, and its eyes were glazed. It lay in the muck, shivering violently, too weak to even lift its head. Clayton Montgomery stepped into the barn, shaking the snow from his Stetson. He took one look at the magnificent firstborn and nodded in approval, then glanced down at the shivering runt. Twin heifers are a nuisance, but twin bulls are just a drain, Clayton muttered, his breath pluming in the frigid air. That little one's half dead already. His lungs are underdeveloped. Don't waste the colostrum replacer on him, Abby. Toss him in the loader bucket and dump him down by the Boneyard Ravine. The cold will take him by morning. Abby's heart seized. Clayton, he's breathing. If I tube him and get him under a heat lamp. I said no. Clayton snapped, his voice hard as frozen dirt. I'm not paying you to run a charity ward. A calf that small will never hit a profitable weaning weight, assuming he even survives the scour season. He's a liability. Dump him, then go check the lower pasture. Clayton turned on his heel and walked out. Abby stared at the tiny creature. The mother, number 812, was entirely focused on cleaning her massive firstborn, completely ignoring the runt. The small calf let out a pathetic, gargling wheeze. Abby had spent the last 2 years watching pieces of her life die. Her father, her herd, her financial stability. She looked at the loader bucket, then at the calf. Not tonight, she whispered, waiting until the heavy diesel engine of Clayton's truck faded down the county road. Abby stripped off her insulated Carhartt jacket. She wrapped the freezing, slime-covered calf in the heavy canvas, hoisted his limp body into her arms, and sprinted for her beat-up Ford A150. She shoved him onto the passenger floorboard, cranked the heater to the maximum, and sped away from Iron Creek. When she arrived back at her own failing farm, Whispering Pines, she immediately called Shuck Henderson, the retired local veterinarian who had been her father's best friend. Doc arrived 20 minutes later in his pajamas and a heavy coat. He took one look at the calf lying on a tarp in Abby's kitchen and sighed heavily. Abigail, you're pouring water into a cracked bucket. His body temperature is 94 degrees. Normal is 101.5. His suckle reflex is completely gone. Even if you warm him, he's got no immune system. I don't care, Abby said fiercely, filling hot water bottles. Show me how to tube him. For the next 8 hours, it was a brutal, desperate war against death. They packed the calf with hot water bottles and aimed 2 hair dryers at his chest. Abby carefully snaked a rubber tube down his throat and into his stomach, slowly pushing life-saving colostrum into his system. At 5 a.m., the calf flatlined. His breathing stopped entirely. "He's gone, Abby," Doc Henderson murmured softly. "No!" Abby shouted. She dropped to her knees, placed her hands on the calf's tiny ribcage, and began doing frantic chest compressions. "Oh, you are not dying! Do you hear me? You are not dying!" She pumped his chest. 1, 2, 3. She blew a sharp breath into his muddy nostrils. Suddenly the calf convulsed. A massive, hacking cough ripped through his small body, spraying amniotic fluid across the kitchen floor. His eyes fluttered open, and he took a deep, ragged, beautiful breath. Doc Henderson leaned back, wiping sweat from his forehead, a stunned smile breaking through his beard. "Well, I'll be damned. What are you going to name him, Abby?" Abby looked at the scrawny, pathetic little survivor. "Samson," she whispered. By late summer, Samson had survived, but he was a laughingstock. While the other calves in the valley were bulking up into thick, square blocks of muscle, Samson looked like a tragic mistake. He was deeply stunted, standing a full foot shorter than calves his own age. He had knobby, oversized knees, a bizarrely long neck, and a fuzzy, dull mahogany coat that refused to shed out in the heat. Because he had been bottle-fed in Abby's backyard, he acted more like an overgrown, clumsy dog than a bull. But Abby's affection for Samson was the only bright spot in a rapidly darkening world. In September, her financial reality crashed down around her. David Caldwell, the loan officer at Western Heritage Bank, sat nervously across from Abby in his sterile office. "Abby, you're 3 months behind on the operating loan. If you can't make a $20,000 payment by December 1st, we have to foreclose on Whispering Pines." Desperate, Abby planned to work double shifts at Iron Creek during the fall weaning run. But Clayton Montgomery had other plans. Clayton had been driving down the county highway when he spotted Abby fixing a fence wire. Standing right behind her, chewing happily on a patch of alfalfa, was Samson. Clayton recognized the distinct yellow Iron Creek ear tag that Abby had never removed, a stark reminder of his origins. Clayton slammed his truck into park and marched over to the fence line, his face flushed with fury. "Is that the 812 twin? You lied to me, Lawson. You stole my property." Abby stood her ground, clutching her fencing pliers. "You ordered me to throw him in the dead pit to freeze, Clayton. By Wyoming livestock statutes, you abandoned him. That makes him salvage. I saved his life. He's a genetic defect on my bloodline," Clayton spat, eyeing the scrawny, awkward yearling with disgust. "And you undermine my authority on my ranch. You're fired, Abby. Pack up your locker, and don't bother asking the feed store for winter credit. I'm calling them today to let them know you're unemployed." Clayton wasn't making an empty threat. By the end of the week, the local feed cooperative abruptly canceled Abby's credit line. The community, heavily dependent on Clayton's massive business, turned a blind eye to her suffering. To buy hay for the winter, Abby was forced into a devastating corner. She had to sell 20 of her best cows, half of her entire breeding herd, at rock-bottom autumn prices. Her neighbor, a weathered but kind farmhand named Wyatt Hayes, leaned against her corral panels one evening, watching Samson trip over his own hooves. "Abby, I know you love him, but that animal is eating you out of house and home. He's got no commercial value. You need to sell him for scrap meat. He's going to cost you this whole farm." Abby looked at Samson. The young bull walked over and gently nudged her shoulder with his massive, blocky head, letting out a soft rumble. "I didn't fight to bring him back from the dead just to put him on a slaughter truck, Wyatt," Abby said, her voice cracking but resolute. "He stays." Winter came, a brutal, punishing freeze that tested the limits of Abby's endurance. She ate rice and beans for months, putting every spare penny toward hay for her remaining cows and Samson. She lay awake at night, the threat of foreclosure hanging over her head like a guillotine. But as the snow began to melt in the spring of 2020, as Samson approached his 18th month, something inexplicable began to happen. In bovine genetics, there is a phenomenon known as compensatory gain, when an animal that has been severely stunted by early trauma suddenly hits a biological threshold and explodes in growth to catch up to its genetic potential. But what happened to Samson was beyond compensatory gain. It was a genetic awakening. It started in his chest. Over a span of just 8 weeks, the awkward, narrow frame cracked wide open. Slabs of dense, terrifyingly thick muscle packed onto his shoulders and hindquarters. His fuzzy, dull coat shed out entirely, revealing a sleek, blindingly shiny coat that was as black as midnight. His neck thickened into a massive crest of pure power, and his knobby knees were suddenly supported by bone structure that looked like it was forged from iron. He didn't just catch up to the other bulls, he dwarfed them. Samson had inherited the absolute best traits of his legendary lineage, the explosive growth of his Simmental side, and the flawless, deep-bodied meat quality of the Angus, traits that had simply been dormant while his body focused entirely on surviving his first year. By his second birthday, Samson weighed an astonishing 2,200 pounds. He was a flawless specimen of agricultural perfection, wide across the back, structurally sound, with a surprisingly gentle temperament around Abby, yet possessing a terrifying aura of dominance. The true test of his transformation came in late October. Abby was asleep when she heard the frantic, high-pitched bellowing of her cows from the north pasture. She threw on her boots, grabbed her father's rifle, and sprinted out into the moonlight. Wyatt, who had been staying in her guest trailer, was right behind her. A pack of 5 feral, starved coyote dog hybrids had breached the fence line and managed to separate a young heifer from the herd. The predators were circling, snapping at the heifer's hocks, preparing to pull her down. Before Abby could even raise her rifle, a sound like thunder erupted from the tree line. It was Samson. The massive bull didn't flee like a normal prey animal. He charged straight into the center of the pack. The ground literally shook beneath his weight. The lead dog lunged at him, but Samson dropped his massive head and threw his 2-ton body upward. He caught the dog perfectly beneath the ribs, launching the predator 10 feet into the air. As the dog hit the ground, broken, Samson let out a deafening, earth-shattering roar, a primal, terrifying sound that echoed across the entire valley. He pawed the earth, tearing up massive chunks of sod, daring the rest of the pack to challenge him. The remaining dogs took one look at the towering black behemoth and scattered in absolute terror, disappearing into the woods. Wyatt lowered his flashlight, his hands shaking. He looked at the massive, rippling silhouette of the bull, standing guard over the trembling heifer. Wyatt slowly turned to Abby, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Abby, what the hell did you feed that thing?" Abby stared at the bull, her heart pounding against her ribs. The Runt that Clayton Montgomery had thrown away to die wasn't a liability. He was a king, and he was about to change everything. By the time the spring calving season of 2021 rolled around, the situation at Whispering Pines was dire. Abby was living on oatmeal and black coffee. The bank had issued a final forbearance if she didn't produce a massive profit from her fall calf crop. The foreclosure papers would be executed by November. Her entire future rested on the 20 cows she had managed to keep, all of which had been bred to Samson. Wyatt Hayes stood by the pasture fence on a frosty April morning, holding a thermos of coffee, his breath pluming in the crisp air. He watched as the first of Samson's calves hit the ground. In the cattle industry, calves typically weigh between 70 and 80 pounds at birth. They are wobbly, fragile creatures that take time to find their footing. But what emerged from Abby's cows was nothing short of unnatural. The first calf, a jet black bull, dropped into the damp spring grass. Within 12 minutes it was on its feet. It didn't stagger. It stood wide and planted, its chest already showing the distinct, blocky musculature of a heavily muscled draft animal. Over the next 3 weeks, all 20 cows delivered safely without a single complication. Every single calf was a carbon copy of Samson, incredibly thick, aggressive at nursing, and vibrating with an untamed, explosive vitality. By late August, the results were undeniable. While the neighboring ranches were raising calves that weighed 400 pounds, Samson's offspring were tipping the scales at a staggering 600 pounds. They were absolute tanks, unfazed by disease, weather, or predators, protected fiercely by the looming 2-ton shadow of their father. Word travels fast in a small agricultural community. Whispers began to circulate at the feed store and the local diner about the monsters grazing over at the failing Lawson place. The rumors eventually reached the ears of Thomas Gallagher, a senior genetics scout for Apex Sire Services, one of the premier livestock genetics syndicates in the country. Thomas was a man who spent his life hunting for the elusive, perfect bull, an animal whose genetics could change the trajectory of the entire beef industry. Acting on a tip from Wyatt, Thomas drove his pristine silver SUV up the muddy, rutted driveway of Whispering Pines. He found Abby mending a water trough, her hands calloused and stained with grease. "Miss Lawson," Thomas said, tipping his hat, "I'm told you have a calf crop that defies standard growth curves. I'd like to see them." Abby led Thomas out to the summer pasture. As they crested the hill, Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. He pulled a pair of high-powered binoculars from his chest harness and stared at the herd. His jaw slowly dropped. "These calves, they're only 5 months old?" Thomas murmured, his voice trembling with professional awe. "Yes, sir," Abby replied, crossing her arms to hide her nervous shivering. "They possess the bone density of a mature yearling and the hindquarter structure of a show champion. I've scouted cattle in 4 countries, Miss Lawson, and I have never seen a commercial herd produce a uniform crop like this." Thomas lowered his binoculars, turning to her with a burning intensity. "I need to see the sire, now." Abby let out a sharp whistle. From the dense cluster of pine trees at the far edge of the pasture, a shadow detached itself. Samson stepped into the sunlight. At 3 years old, he was a terrifying, magnificent force of nature. He weighed 2,400 pounds. His neck was a crest of rippling, absolute power, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian. He walked with a heavy, deliberate grace, stopping a few yards from Abby to let out a low, bass-heavy rumble that vibrated through the soles of Thomas's boots. Thomas was speechless. He slowly pulled out his checkbook. "Miss Lawson, Apex Sire Services wants to syndicate him. We will buy the exclusive rights to collect and sell his semen globally. I can write you an advance check right now for $200,000, with royalties that could exceed $1 million over the next 5 years. But there is one absolute condition." Abby's heart stopped. "What condition?" "To register a bull for elite syndication, we have to run a full DNA panel to map his genomic profile and trace his pedigree," Thomas explained, pulling a sterile hair sample kit from his jacket. "We need to know exactly where this king came from." Abby hesitated, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. She knew exactly where Samson came from, but she nodded, allowing Thomas to pluck a tuft of tail hair from the massive bull. 10 days later, the DNA results hit the National Cattle Registry database, and the alarm sounded. The registry's computer system flagged a 99% genetic match. Samson was the direct, unrecorded progeny of cow number 812 and a legendary $1 million sire named Iron Duke. Both were the exclusive copyrighted property of Iron Creek Cattle Company. Within 48 hours, Clayton Montgomery found out. The runt he had ordered dumped in a freezing ditch was now the most valuable genetic asset in the state of Wyoming. And Clayton wanted him back. The morning Abby was supposed to sign the syndication contract, 3 vehicles roared up the driveway of Whispering Pines, kicking up a cloud of white dust. Leading the pack was Clayton Montgomery's custom heavy-duty truck, followed by a sublet county sheriff's cruiser and a livestock trailer. Abby stepped off the porch, her blood turning to ice. Wyatt Hayes came out of the barn, a heavy wrench gripped tightly in his fist. Clayton slammed his truck door, flanked by a man in an expensive suit holding a leather briefcase. Clayton's face was twisted in a sneer of victorious arrogance. "Afternoon, Abigail," Clayton said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. I've got a court order signed by a district judge. The DNA proves that bull belongs to my bloodline. You stole Iron Creek property, hid him for 3 years, and tried to profit off my genetics. The sheriff is here to impound the animal, and my lawyer is filing a lawsuit to seize your farm as restitution for the stolen profits." Sheriff Miller, a man who had known Abby's father, looked deeply uncomfortable. "Abby, I'm sorry. The genetic markers are undeniable. Legally, the sire belongs to Iron Creek. If you resist, I have to arrest you for grand larceny." Abby looked at the livestock trailer. She looked at Clayton, a man who had built an empire by crushing the weak. A fierce, blinding rage ignited in her chest. She had starved for this farm. She had frozen in the mud to breathe life into the lungs of a creature Clayton had thrown away like trash. "No," Abby said softly, then raised her voice, her tone ringing like struck steel. "You are not taking my bull." "Load him up, Sheriff," Clayton ordered. Before the sheriff could move, Doc Henderson's old pickup truck careened into the driveway, sliding to a halt. The retired veterinarian stepped out, carrying a heavy, leather-bound medical ledger. He marched directly up to Clayton, his eyes burning with years of suppressed disgust. "Nobody is seizing anything today without a hearing before the Wyoming Livestock Board," Doc Henderson bellowed, holding up the ledger. "Because I just filed an emergency injunction in Cheyenne," Clayton scoffed. "An injunction based on what? She stole my calf." "Based on Title 11, Chapter 29 of the Wyoming Agricultural Statutes regarding animal cruelty and salvage," Doc Henderson fired back, his voice echoing across the yard. On the night of April 14th, you explicitly ordered this woman to dump a living, breathing newborn calf into a boneyard ravine to freeze to death. I have the veterinary intake logs from that exact night, time-stamped and sworn, documenting the animal's core temperature at 94 degrees and noting your refusal to provide colostrum. The lawyer in the suit suddenly frowned, looking at Clayton. "You didn't mention you abandoned the animal to die." "It was a runt, a commercial liability." Clayton spat, his face flushing red. "It was a living creature." Abby stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the wealthy rancher. "You threw him away because you only look at spreadsheets. You didn't see his heart, but I did. I brought him back from the dead. Under the salvage laws of this state, an animal intentionally abandoned to die without humane euthanasia is forfeited by the owner. You have no legal claim to him, Clayton. You forfeited your rights the second you told me to leave him for the coyotes." The emergency hearing took place 3 days later in the cramped municipal building of Sublette County. The room was packed with local ranchers, feed store owners, and representatives from Apex Sire Services. Clayton's high-priced lawyer tried to argue that the calf was merely misplaced and that the DNA copyright superseded salvage laws. But Thomas Gallagher, the genetics scout, stood up to testify. "Members of the board," Thomas said calmly, adjusting his glasses. "Apex Sire Services has reviewed the records of Iron Creek Cattle Company. Mr. Montgomery's herd has been suffering from a quiet epidemic of genetic fragility. He culls so aggressively based on arbitrary birth weights that he has bred the natural immunity right out of his cattle. The only reason this phenomenal bull survived is because Miss Lawson removed him from Mr. Montgomery's toxic environment and fostered the compensatory genetics that Iron Creek has been systematically destroying." The room erupted into shocked murmurs. In the cattle industry, reputation is everything. Clayton Montgomery was being publicly exposed, not just as cruel, but as an incompetent breeder. The 3-panel board reviewed Doc Henderson's sworn medical ledger, the state statutes on animal abandonment, and the undeniable truth of Abby's intervention. The ruling was unanimous. The gavel fell with a loud crack. By order of the Wyoming Livestock Board, The claim of ownership by Iron Creek Cattle Company is permanently dismissed. The bull, known as Samson, is the legal, exclusive property of Abigail Lawson. Case closed. The courtroom erupted into cheers. Wyatt threw his hat in the air. Doc Henderson pulled Abby into a massive hug, tears streaming down his weathered face. Clayton Montgomery sat at his table, pale and trembling. He hadn't just lost a $1 million bull, he had lost his reputation. Within a month, his premium buyers canceled their contracts, disgusted by the revelations of his breeding practices. Iron Creek Cattle Company began a rapid, irreversible decline. Poetic justice had finally come to Sublette County. That afternoon, back at Whispering Pines, Mr. Caldwell from the bank personally drove out to hand-deliver the cleared mortgage papers. Abby had signed the syndication contract with Apex Sire Services right on the hood of her beat-up Ford truck. The advance alone was enough to pay off the farm's entire debt, with enough left over to buy the adjacent 200 acres. Botcher. As the sun began to set, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant shades of gold and violet, Abby walked out into the lush pasture. Samson was waiting for her. The colossal black bull turned his massive head, letting out a soft, familiar rumble that shook the ground. Abby leaned against his thick, muscular shoulder, running her hand over his gleaming coat. He closed his eyes, resting his heavy chin near her shoulder, as gentle as the frail, freezing creature she had wrapped in her jacket 3 years ago. He was the runt that the world had thrown away, but because one woman chose compassion over convenience, he had become the king of the valley, the savior of her legacy, and the living embodiment of a bond that no amount of money could ever buy. What an incredible journey of resilience, compassion, and ultimate poetic justice. Abby and Samson proved that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the places others overlook. If this story of the underdog fighting back and winning it all gave you chills, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button, share this video with a friend who loves a good comeback story, and hit subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss out on our next real-life tale.